Hey, what's up, y'all? This is Koski of Funday back on it for you and for yours. And before I get into this, I gotta give a shout out to my ancestors. And I gotta give a shout out to y'all for, watching, liking, subscribing to the videos. Things are kind of crazy as of late because the worldwide madness, so to speak. But we still here, we still banging, we still balling, we still making it happen, doing what we do for our people worldwide. Why? Because that's what we do. Now this one right here is Liberation Movements in Southern Africa by Nathan Shamyurira, University of Dar-es-Salaam, Tanzania. Now this is pretty dope right here, you know what I'm saying? He talks about a lot of good stuff we don't have to get into because he dropped a bunch of knowledge about what was the thing about it. This comes from the 8th Memorial Hans Wolff Lecture, April 14, 1977. You can also get this at the African Studies Program, Indiana University, Bloomington, Indiana, 1978. It goes into a little quick backdrop about Hans Wolff, the guy who did this thing, a little quick backdrop about him, who got the conference set up and things of that nature, a German guy. We're not going into his biography right now, but he worked for military intelligence and things of that nature. Now, without further ado, we'll get into it. Liberation movements in Southern Africa. Introduction. Southern Africa is the most developed region in Africa. It is deeply integrated into the world capitalist system. The pace and the pattern of development in the region has been set by the Republic of South Africa. The industrial and the mining complex, which was established in the Republic in the 19th century and was developed and diversified in the first half of this century, has provided the impetus for economic growth in the region. The South African mining and industrial complex have relied on foreign capital and technology from the United States, Western Europe, and Japan for successive stages of its expansion. Such reliance has created a South African capitalism that is dependent upon outside support. This dependent capitalism has turned and fostered its own periphery in Rhodesia, Namibia, and Botswana, and the right rural semi-colonies, and in some independent African states on which the South African labor depends on for labor, and markets for its expanding manufacturers. It is within this periphery that wars of national liberation are now being waged. Because Southern Africa is more economically developed than other parts of Africa, and because that development is tied to Western capitalist systems, in the attempt of liberation movements to change the political status quo by transferring power to the representatives of the majority of Africans are bound to arouse deep passions. They imping on us issues that are fundamental to the West and the world at large. International attention to this region has increased as liberation movements have taken over power in Mozambique and Angola, and are now challenging the ruling elites in Zimbabwe, Rhodesia at that time, and Namibia. In the last 2 years, Southern Africa has become a substantive problem on the agenda of the major world powers, both capitalist and socialist. Liberation, a nationalist or a class struggle. Stated simply and briefly, the problem in Southern Africa is one of the liberations of 23 million indigenous people residing in South Africa, Namibia, and Zimbabwe. But there is little agreement among the contending forces within them as to what liberation means or should mean. So all of the liberation movements, they couldn't agree what liberation means. There are currently 3 competing and contradictory views of liberation. The South African and the Rhodesian governments advocate separatorial development of Africans through a glorified Botswana system and are totally opposed to the aims of African nationalism. A second widely held view is that the African nationalist movements, which are similar to those that won independence in most African colonies in the 60s, are supported by various groups throughout Africa. Finally, The most liberating and revolutionary process is that experienced by Angola and Mozambique. These three positions are not easily reconciled because, in the final analysis, they raise questions that are basic to one's view of the state and of society. Hamad Amin accurately described the main features of the post-colonial state in Africa and Asia. Although each colonial situation has its own specific particular features, he observed three general characteristics: the strength of the administrative bureaucracy and the military, that is one. Two, the continuing presence of former metropolitan colonial power through its already established commercial and trade links. And three, the function of the politician as mediators between the metropolitan and the indigenous bourgeoisie and as protectors of existing social order. Ultimately, these three factors result in the manipulation or suppression of demands and the aspiration of the workers and peasants. I believe warned that neither the national bourgeoisie nor any class in post-colonial state is strong enough to control the bureaucratic military oligarchy left by the colonial system. The central proposition, which I wish to emphasize, is that the state in a post-colonial society is not the instrument of a single class. It is relatively autonomous and it mediates between competing interests of the three property classes, namely the metropolitan bourgeoisie and the indigenous bourgeoisie and the landed class, while at the same time acting on behalf of all of them to preserve the social order which their interests are embedded, namely the institution of private property and capitalist mode as the dominant mode of production. But there are no strongly articulated indigenous bourgeoisie or land class in most African states. Therefore, if we accept our thesis, it is the mediation of the African ruling group on behalf of the metropolitan bourgeoisie that we must examine closely. The reliance on foreign aid and investment, foreign markets, and foreign technology has continued and vastly increased the independent African states. The works by Shamyurira in West Africa and by Colin Leeds, Justin Lano, and Clive Thomas, and Dan Naber in East Africa has clearly shown a pattern of continual and even accelerated dependency. These writers demonstrate that the attainment of political independence did not end the exploitation continued through economic and commercial institutions established during the colonial period. Thus, capitalism, both local and international, continued to thrive. The inability of African peasants and workers to challenge or to change the capitalism as the dominant mode of production in independent African states has contributed to their continuing dependency and underdevelopment and has established a weak rear base for a liberation struggle in Southern Africa. Most of the ruling elites in independent African states share a common interest with imperialism and maintaining the existing local social order. In Africa as a whole, and in Southern Africa in particular, we will produce more evidence below to support this statement. Although the nationalist movements that brought independence to most African states in the 1960s failed or refused to challenge the basic tenets of capitalism, they did play a positive role in asserting the national question. They aroused and directed the masses toward the attainment of nationhood and independence for people who have been subjugated to colonialism and domination for several centuries. The climax of this movement was the signing of the Organization of African Unity, the OAU, charter in Abydos in May 1963, which rightly stressed the need to end colonialism on every inter-African soil. It is the essence to see clearly both a positive aspects and a possible limitation of African nationalism as a liberating force. Some super Marxists argue that the national struggle for Zimbabwe, Namibia, and Tanzania, currently called South Africa, are ultimately counter-revolutionary. They will lead to a kind of neo-colonial situation described above in which capitalism remained unchallenged. And on a sidebar, they was kind of right. They was kind of right about that. They would contend that the struggle must be seen only in the context of the international class confrontation between the worker peasant class on one side and the property-owning national bourgeoisie on the other. To accept this proposition, however, is to be overly simplistic. Karl Marx supported Irish nationalism, and Lenin criticized Rosa Luxemburg's position on Polish nationalism. Lenin also publicly supported Joseph Stalin's pamphlet on the national question. These writers saw the national question as an integral part of the class question. Both questions are legitimate and must be proposed simultaneously. A people cannot be colonized and free from exploitation and oppression at the same time. Patriotic African nationalists like Nkrumah and Nasser were right to assert the nationalist question at the time they did. Our quarrel is that they did so without relating the historical to the class question and the ownership meaning of production. However, the class question is now being raised in Southern Africa, where it constitutes a core of the general political crisis in the area. South Africa, a classic nationalist class situation. The Republic of South Africa is at the heart of the South Imperial region system of Southern Africa. Its capitalist system is dependent upon Europe and America for fresh capital and technology that operate mostly in a partnership with local capital. South Africa also looks to the vocal and vital labor supplies within Southern Africa to maintain these industries. As Harold Wiltrop and Marcus Azanzig have pointed out, the apartheid system is literally a system to preserve a permanent reserve army of laborers for the growing process industries of South Africa. The economic base of South Africa has changed from traditional mining and agriculture to that of manufacturing, growing manufacturing industry, manufacturing and processing now, and accounting of 40% of the gross national product. Since this evolution requires a stable labor force, it has liberalized the political system to the extent that South African industrialists are calling for the recognition of trade unions, the removal of job reservations, and the end of petty apartheid. Furthermore, the industrialists who want marketing outlets for their manufacturing goods have pressed Southern African government and to begin a dialogue with the Black African states, what Bush has called the Detente. This policy aims to create a Southern African common market and a free trade area beyond the Zambezi that would be dominated by South African manufacturers. Both English and Afrikaner-speaking industrialists in South Africa have now joined this drive to the north. And South Africa has a trade and a relationship with about 10 African states. In the political field, Dante points out the common interest between the national bourgeoisie of South Africa and the bourgeoisie in the independent African states, especially in such areas sharing technology and utilizing much needed food and oil. Agreements have succeeded in Zaire and to a limited extent in Zimbabwe. But within South Africa itself, the African liberation movements must start regarding the white worker as a potential allies with whom they can build bonds of solidarity. That utopian view has no validity because the white workers have been co-opted into the white ruling class. They know the way differential between a white and black worker was 13-1 in 1960 and 14-1 in 1970. The gaps continue to widen because the racist white trade unionists have committed the government to the policy of wage differentials and maintaining the size of the gap. If black workers get a wage increase as a result of a strike, the white workers immediately demand a corresponding increase in wages to prevent the wage gap from narrowing. White workers know that the inflated wages they receive and the high standard of living they enjoy is cremated off the surplus produced by underpaying the black workers whom they supervise. Therefore, white workers in South Africa form a privileged class that effectively join the ruling national bourgeoisie. A few individuals among the workers or intellectuals may join and support the liberation movement, but their support will never be class-wide. The Congressional Alliance, for example, associated whites and Indians with the African National Congress, the ANC. After the Morocco Conference of 1969, the ANC decided to accept non-black members. And one of his white members, the former South African Communist Party, Joe Slavo, became a member of the National Executive of the ANC. But it's important to remember that the participation of the individual committed whites in liberation struggles does not indicate a whole class will participate. South Africa is both racist and a capitalist society with a white ruling class and a black ruling class. The correlation between the race and class is nearly perfect, although some subclasses of the ruling class are more important than others. The Soweto and Langa uprisings in June 1976 were only a visible tip of a full-fledged struggle between white bourgeoisie and the black working class in South Africa, a class struggle in the classical sense of the concept. Young students who burned down their schools and workers who refused to go to work represent an advanced element of the proletarian class that has been developed in South Africa for many years. The peasantry declined sharply over the years as successful government measures undermined traditional and self-sufficient modes of production. Deprived of adequate land and cattle, they are hardly to be expected to survive. Several government commissions, including the Authority Thomason Commission on the Implementation of a Separate Development, have argued that the areas set aside for the Bantus in South Africa are not capable of maintaining their present population, let alone increasing the population of the future. It should be stressed that this is the process of patronizing of the peasantry above the deliberate government attempts to increase the labor supply has been going on steady throughout Southern Africa, most notably in South Africa itself, but also Namibia, Zimbabwe, Mozambique, and Angola. Lesotho, Botswana, and Swaziland are almost client states of South Africa. As in most countries of the world, the earnings of the black workers in South Africa has fallen in real terms because of the combination of inflation and unemployment. The impact of this inflation-unemployment cycle has been much greater on the poorly paid black workers than their white counterparts. It was a combination of deteriorating economic conditions and extensive polarization of the liberation movements that raised the worker consciousness to high levels in both Namibia and South Africa, and in a way prepared the ground for incidents in Soweto and Langa in 1976. Nature and imperialism in Southern Africa. The fact is that the reality lit the fuse in Southern Africa was the internationalizing of the Angolan conflict. Through the divisive presentation of the Soviet Union in Cuba, in which the MPLA, victory of the rival movements, UNITA and the FLNA, the MPLA had used Russian weaponry and Cuban military training for years. Indeed, the MPLA was one of the so-called ethnic liberation movements Russia has supported since 1967. Cuba had invited these authentic movements to the Trilateral Congress in February 1966 and offered them military training. Springing from a core of African intellectuals who were members of the Communist Party of Portugal, the MPLA utilized and expanded its relations with Cuba and Russia. Throughout the long liberation struggle, the MPLA steadily defined its goals and ideology as Marxist-Leninist. Thus, by the time the Civil War broke out between the political culture within the movement, made Russia and Cuba a both inevitable and only acceptable option. A very important consequence of the Angola Civil War was the defeat of the South African at the hands of the non-white Angola and Cuban fighters. This defeat destroyed the myth that South African forces were invincible. Supporters of the South African regime, among the academics in Britain and the U.S., as well as African counter-revolutionaries like Presidents Kamazu Banda of Moai, had joined a chorus proclaiming the military might of South Africa. And yet, in the same way, the Vietnamese and Cambodia defeated the U.S. in Indochina. The quantitative military power of South Africa can be matched by guerrillas in Zimbabwe and Namibia. The defeat of the South Africa and Angola also means the defeat of a certain type of indigenous bourgeoisie characteristics of UNITA and FNLA that would have preserved capitalism and enhanced the influence of a metropolitan bourgeoisie of Portugal and South Africa, in particular, and of Western Europe and North America in general. It is no surprise that Henry Kissinger, U.S. former Secretary of State, took calculating steps to de-radicalize the liberation movement and defuse the situation in Zimbabwe and Namibia. The imperialist U.S. strategy with Southern Africa encouraged explicit recognition and support for South Africa. Kissinger visited South Africa in 1976, the first ever made by a U.S. Secretary of State to South Africa. In the military and financial agreement between the two countries over gold and oil that made the Geneva Conference on Rhodesia possible are the example of such explicit recognition. The U.S. also accepted South African homogeny over the Bantus and the neighboring states of Botswana, Lesotho, Swaziland, Namibia, and Zimbabwe, even if the last two states fall under control of black rule. Finally, the U.S. supported stringent neocolonial ties among the frontline states so to weaken the rear base for liberation movements. The only sacrificial lamb for this strategy was Ann Smith. This Rhodesian regime must go in order to secure South Africa and at the same time strengthen neocolonialism on its borders. Most importantly, the Angolan struggle unmasked the nature of imperialism itself in South Africa. It was no coincidence that South Africa, the United States, Britain, West Germany, France, Italy, and Japan found themselves on the same side. Indeed, if the U.S. Congress had authorized the funds requested by the State Department, there might have been a massive Western military presence in Angola. In fact, the entry of South African troops in Angola to occupy the colonial dams, a move that was only lightly condemned in the Western press, and their thrust almost to Luanda, was based on the premise they maintained that the Western powers will be sending reinforcements. It was the entry of the Cuban troops that provoked the strongest protests from the Western powers. Multi-international corporations and Western governments had heavily financed interests in Angola economy, especially in its gold, its oil, and minerals. Zaire, Zambia, Angola, Namibia, and Southern Africa together constitute the richest mineral and natural resources area on the continent. The multinational countries and the government of Western Europe and North America wanted to keep these resources for themselves. To these factors must be added the strategic interests of the U.S. and NATO powers. The latter have been authorized to operate south of the Tropic of Cancer in the Southern Atlantic and Indian Ocean in order to protect trading and shipping routes around the Cape of Good Hope. The United States, France, and Britain have established new military bases in the Indian Ocean, supposedly to preserve their modesty there in the face of increased presence of the Soviet Union. After the visit to Africa of then U.S. Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld in 1976, the U.S. started arming pro-Western regimes such as Kenya and Zaire. Zaire is known today, Zaire is known today as the Congo. That's where Patrice Lumumba was from. So the guy that betrayed Patrice Lumumba, Mobutu, became the Western puppet for the United States. So they just kept giving him guns and shit. At the same time, France and Italy were sending massive amounts of technology and armaments to Southern Africa. French and Italian companies are licensed to produce a wide range of weapons in South Africa in collaborations with the South African Frontier Armor and Development Corporation. The United States is reportedly sending in enriched uranium to South Africa and France and West Germany as assisting in building a nuclear capability. So they was gonna give these people the atomic bomb, basically. You know what I mean? To keep all the black folks away. The same way they did it in Israel, because they need that spot. South Africa's a hot spot in the world. They need that. Same thing with Israel. They need that for the Red Sea and coming down to the Suez Canal. You know what I'm saying? To cut them trips in half. So those are two vital hotspots in Africa, Israel and South Africa. They gonna be willing to die for. All right, let's keep going. In addition to the economic and military and strategic interests of the West and Southern Africa, one should not forget or underestimate the human element, what Smith calls KITH and KIN. Now, sorry, but I want you to pay attention to this KITH and KIN policy of Ann Smith he brought up. And it still goes on today. This one way back, from when they kicked the Moors out of Spain. This is a policy they've been under. People in Western Europe feel emotionally and culturally close to the white settlers in Africa, a situation that the European governments cannot ignore. A strong streak of racism also runs through most Western countries, especially Britain. Among those factors, an outburst of racial ill feelings against non-white immigrants in Britain in the 1960s prevented Harold Wilson's government from taking any serious action against the Smith regime in Rhodesia. For these reasons, when the chips are down, I believe the West will be on the side of the white settler governments of Southern Africa, supporting them either directly or indirectly through African public regimes. And that's how it went on today. And that's how it still goes on today. You know what I'm saying? Because of the KITH and KIN policy. You know, I should do a video on that to explain a little bit more deeper about that. But we're gonna, you know, that's really for another time, I guess. You know, but it always happens. They don't click up together because, like I said before, they're culturally, like Ann Smith said, we are culturally and emotionally close to Western Europe. That goes for people in Australia, New Zealand. I don't care where you're at in the world. They don't feel culturally and emotionally close to y'all. The policy of KITH and KIN, which, by the way, is a policy, you know, in my opinion, it's a natural policy. You know what I'm saying? That's just naturally going to happen. I can't knock him telling the truth, you know. Anyway, this is a Coach Gift Sunday. Much love to you and yours. We're going to do a video on that, you know what I'm saying, on KITH and KIN policy to break it down a little bit more. But subscribe to the channel, you know what I'm saying? Hey, y'all stay safe out there because, you know what I'm saying, that COVID-19 ain't no joke. It's knocking cats off their leg. So, you know, you got to wear a mask, You know, life can change. You just roll with the punches. Hey, much love to you and yours. Peace.